So my group, I'm sorry, let's start with introductions first. How about that? Yeah. So I'm Miles Marenka.
I'm Tim Cummings.
I'm Meredith Miller.
I'm Mara Kamasi.
I'm Dipti Wade.
And that's our group. So we were charged, as we were introduced, with putting a business inventory manual and template together for West Roxbury Main Streets District. Now we did this in conjunction with the Department of Neighborhood Development and West Roxbury Main Streets, and the Main Streets District is a part of the Department of Neighborhood Development. So as you see from our slide up here, there were 3 steps that we went about this. First, we created a business inventory template and a manual. Then we used West Roxbury as our pilot for this manual that we had created. And then for our next steps, we did a business district analysis, which is an in-depth analysis of Main Streets on a much broader scale, rather than focusing on West Roxbury, which is what we did obviously. This was a more general report about Main Streets districts all across the country. And really the main point of that was to set up the director of the Main Streets districts and the people at the Department of Neighborhood Development was sort of like a next step. We created this template and the manual. We went and we got the information on West Roxbury, but then we wanted them to have an idea of what the next step is, what's further, just beyond their strategy, which was to get this list with contact information with basic business inventory data. So, the functions of the database, this was as described by our client, was to provide the Main Streets Director with an accurate overview of the business mix and up-to-date contact information. That was one. The next was to get the assessment of the perceived business needs as according to the owners and employees that we encountered when we went and actually did this. And then the last step was to create a spreadsheet out of all of this with the data that we collected. So there are actually 2 spreadsheets. I'd like to make this a little bit more clear. The first is just a blank template that we created for them to use their 19 business districts throughout the city of Austin. We did 1. So then we populated it for West Roxbury. So here's our pilot. This is a little bit more about what it actually took for us to get the information that we needed. So we were handed an incomplete business inventory. The categories weren't as fleshed out as we ended up making them. It was a little bit simpler. Through our experience both getting out and canvassing and talking to the director of West Roxbury Main Streets, Kara O'Connor, and the director of the Office of Business Development, Raphael Carbone, and the director of the Main Streets districts in general, Steve Gilman. This was sort of what we determined. So it was a collaborative effort, them telling us what they wanted, and then us also going out and collecting more information and sort of tailoring it, the database to what we saw. So we determined things like appropriate categories for it. We're going to flesh this out a little bit more later. And so total time, it took us about 40 to 50 hours of actually hitting the streets. We went out and we walked around West Roxbury and we talked to people and we interviewed them and we just sort of got a feel of what the business district was. So we used that to fill out our spreadsheets. And then the last thing that we did was we determined the NAICS codes. Now NAICS stands for North American Industrial Classification System. This is something we added. This was something that they had expressed. They expressed desire to know the business mix, but they didn't have as a clear objective for what they wanted out of it. We used this classification system that's used all across the country. It's standard. It's really detailed, and that's what we went with. And sort of the purpose of this was that everyone's going to use this a little differently. The director of the Main Streets program, Steve Gilman, is probably going to want something different than the director of an individual Main Streets district. Raphael, who's the director of business development, might have some other use for it. So we wanted to make sure that it really covered a lot of different uses, and that's what we tried to do. And here's a little chart. This is just a quick breakdown of what we found. So in 2006, there were 214 total businesses that they had recorded, and in 2011, so 5 years later, we counted 193. And we'll go into the individual breakdown a little bit more, but as you can see all the way up at the top, the finance, insurance, and real estate and legal section dropped in the last couple of years, which certainly makes a certain amount of intuitive sense. And we were pretty pleased with it. Now, moving on, Dipti's going to take it from here and explain the manual that we created.
So we created a business inventory manual to explain all the 19 districts on how to fill the inventory, and we explained each heading. I mean, it's very evident that one knows what a business is or what the first or last name is, but it's just to regularize how people fill in the inventory, because when 5 of us were working on filling the spreadsheet, all of us had different methods to fill them in, and when all the 19 districts fill the spreadsheet, it should be consistent, and when it goes to the high authority, like the Department of Neighborhood Development, they should be able to use the data efficiently. So how we did it was the first column, the business column, was locked, so that when you scroll through the columns, it you know which business you're looking at. And go to the next slide. So we explain how to fill each column, and placeholders like none or not applicable were supposed to be added where information was not available. For example, say the rent, which was not disclosed by many of the business owners. It's very understandable because it's a very sensitive issue. So if you left it blank, there would be a misunderstanding whether the information is available or it's overlooked, and so that's why we wanted to add things like not available. And another example would be the phone number. It is formatted so that there is a consistent style of having the parentheses and in the number. So the people just have to worry about entering the number and not formatting it the way it should be done. So, and now Tim will continue.
So, as Miles indicated earlier, we took a methodology of going out and meeting with the different business owners, property owners, managers, to get a sense of the mix of the district. And this graph up here shows you essentially a comparison between data that was given to us in 2006 and the business data that we were able to collect in 2011. As the graph indicates, business has gone down overall, as Miles pointed out, between 2006 and 2011. But an interesting point that Miles mentioned was finance, insurance, real estate, and legal, the very first column on the left, dropped off dramatically, which is an interesting data point to mention. The next slide. Another interesting data point, actually, that we learned from this exercise is that 65%. I'm sorry, 60.
Yes.
65% don't have email access. 35% have email access, which just speaks to communication and whether technology, how people can really reach a business and whatnot, the different mediums to actually reach their clients or customers, or even how the district can try to communicate with their businesses in their district. Another interesting data point that we learned while we were out meeting with the different businesses is 156 respondents said that they didn't really know what their business needs are. Now that could have been very much because we didn't prep them beforehand, and on the spot they couldn't think of anything. It's definitely a question that should be explored, or whether there's actually a stronger point of evidence that maybe that the business has some really, business owners don't really know what their needs are, and you should, and the district could look at exploring possibly helping with professional development of some sort. And then other issues that were of concern throughout the district that was of note were pretty consistent things you'd hear: networking, marketing, Restore, which is a program for helping signs and visibility and whatnot to help with business development. But the second point to note is actually parking, an overall theme that was expressed in a certain manner, which I'll talk about in a few minutes later on, was the idea that parking is an issue within the district, within the West Roxbury community. So with that being said, we developed some recommendations with the analysis of the business mix. Parking, we made a recommendation that something to explore is increasing the 2-hour enforcement within the district. Right now, the businesses were complaining that the parking spots in front of the storefronts were being used by vehicles and left for really long periods of time, 4, 6, 8 hours, eating up that parking spot. So a need for enforcement would help alleviate that situation. That's a low-cost remedy, and it would help nudge the behavior of the business, of the clientele, of the residents and the businesses clientele within the district to conform to the way you'd want them to. So that was an interesting point. A long-term parking solution that we would suggest would be doing a transportation and a pedestrian feasibility study. So that was one of the recommendations. Another recommendation was increased signage for parking that's actually available behind the storefronts, which a lot of people weren't even aware of, that there was some storefronts that had purchased parking behind their stores for their clients and customers, but no one even knew that this parking was even available. So investing a little bit up front in signage would pay off dividends in the long run by helping with the business development. Plus, overall signage in general was also expressed as an issue, and helping the businesses identify where they are within the district would help increase the businesses. Lastly is continued communication between the district and the businesses, with between the district director and the business owners and property owners within the district was also expressed. But as we cited earlier, lack of email access, and if that's your main way of trying to communicate, there would obviously be a disconnect. So that was no surprise to learn that. So with that, next steps. This was the first step of what would hopefully be a multi-step process. You could do a further analysis to compare the district with other communities that you're trying to endeavor to replicate, and you can use differing indicators of demographics to do some sort of market analysis. As the next slide will show, you can compare demographics, square footage, different restaurant types to enhance the business development of a community and within the corridor overall. So with that being said, any questions?
Yeah, okay, let me ask the quick question here, and this is something that I want to reflect on for a minute. When you began the project, what was the problem as the client defined it for you? What was the problem as you were presented with it originally?
In layman's terms, we want to know who's in our district and how to contact them.
Okay, so this was a Main Street, the Main Street executive director, that is the person in charge of this, wanted to sort of have a sense of basically what, in this case, her clientele looked like.
Mm-hmm. And
okay.
she also stated that there were far too many of one type of business and not enough parking for everybody. Those were kind of the other main things.
So there was a sort of a common received wisdom about the nature of what she was facing. And as time went on, how did that sort of change? I mean, you obviously made that point about parking, that you discovered there wasn't the parking problem. Yeah, what were the two biggest surprises you encountered, if I recall from your presentation? One was parking.
Parking wasn't like a huge
Yeah.
surprise. It's more of like people have this perception, but
Mhm.
it might actually not be true.
Mhm.
We weren't able to do like a transportation study, so we
Mhm.
couldn't give them that accurate information. So that's why we suggested it. But I think like the lack of emails, or even the fact that a lot of them were saying they'd never met Kara or talked to her or heard of Main Streets, and
So although the Main Street coordinator, in this case Kara, was emailing to people, the information wasn't getting out there to the businesses who may have had personal emails but didn't have any kind of work or business-related email. And I think one of your suggestions to her from that was what? An idea that you
It was a great idea. Actually, Stephanie had a wonderful idea, which is to provide email addresses for these businesses via the website for the West Roxbury Main Streets. So to do something like that, one, it would ensure that you would be able to reach them, and two, then it cultivates them to be part of your organization.
Takeaway lesson for the Main Street director and also for the Main Street people who were there on Friday about what it took to compile what on the surface seems a relatively simple inventory of businesses, and yet what was your takeaway message to them?
really explain that.
Well, what I said last week was I went into the project with a preconceived notion that this would not be very time consuming and this wouldn't be a huge effort. However, I was completely wrong, and my thought process changed 180%. And an element to this project, which we hadn't really touched upon yet, was there was this idea that this template would be, or this tool would be done within a certain time frame by July by all the different districts. As we said, we populated West Roxbury, but the hope by the Court Street folks was that the other main streets would be able to do this as well. And we wanted to make sure that there was a proper expectation on their end, that we were a team of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, and we worked on this consistently for 3 months. And with the West Roxbury Main Streets, you're talking about one person with a couple volunteers. I can only assume that other main streets are like that. So you wanted the expectations to be realistic. But as I also said, that this was a wonderful exercise and a great piece of information to have, and that it can be used in so many different ways. It's definitely something worthwhile to do. You just putting an unfair expectation on the district directors is something that I would caution.
So that was an unexpected, perhaps, piece of information for the client about what it actually would take to do what on the surface was be a relatively simple project, and yet the amount of time it took.
Absolutely.
The amount of people time. Questions from our audience? Yeah.
Actually, were you able to identify the routes, the bus routes that service this area, and did you know if any of them were key bus routes by the MBTA standards? Because there's already studies being done. If they're key bus routes, there's already capital money out there to improve those corridors, and a lot of what you touched upon, improving bus stops, improving parking, and all those things. So I think it would be a great stepping point if one of these routes is a key bus route, you know, being able to have that email and that contact and getting the businesses involved, especially in the public meetings and the planning process. And that's all currently going on right now. So, just a thought.
Well, we need somebody from transportation. Yeah.
Could you guys, I know that you looked at numbers of businesses for the different NAICS codes that you broke down, but is there a way, or were you able to in any way look at the sales volume for the individual business locations? Because I would imagine that even though they're in fewer locations, if those same types of businesses had increased sales, and it may offset somewhat. So was that information available to you? Do you know if you would be able to get any of that information?
It wasn't available, however, part of the, go back a slide. That's part of a retail analysis that we suggested in our report to them. Same thing with the restaurant, it goes into collecting information from the business owners about like their sales volume and their capital, and same thing with the customer origin, it's having them collect zip codes of their customers to find out what their customer base is, and then they find out their trade area, people taking bus, across? Are they driving? Like, are they going and stopping and eating, or are they going and just stopping at one store and then leaving the district? It's all in that. We weren't able to get those numbers.
I was just curious how they got the 06 data. Did they walk around, but they didn't have a template, or?
I don't know if we're 100% clear on how they had it, and that was
They did not
and that
provide
was
their
one of the
methodology.
reasons that we went to great lengths to really record how we did this, and even, I mean, you might have been, you know, thinking while Dipti was explaining how we, I mean, we really explained that manual, you know, to more of an extent than really any of us wanted to. But the reason we did it was because we did it so that when people would look at it, they would really know exactly what our thought process was and then how we went about doing it.
So this will set a baseline that moving forward you can use consistent data to try to do some sort of analysis.
I mean, remember, the value to the client here is that it's a takeaway that allows the client to actually apply it elsewhere and have realistic expectations about what's being done.
Exactly.
Amanda, go ahead.
Going back to Amanda's question, can you talk a little bit about your experience of the business owners in this survey? I mean, it sounded like you guys really couldn't get rent information. I'm wondering if you think that would really impact the recommendation to do this retail analysis or getting more detail about their customer base or how much money they're making.
I think that most of the business owners are pretty happy to talk, but as we talked about last week, they're all really busy because they're all small businesses. So we'd come in and ask a question and they'd be doing 3 different things, and okay, hold on a second, and they didn't really totally know who we were because the majority of them know the West Main Streets. So if there was more familiarity with what the Main Streets was doing and how they could be helping them, I think they'd be more interested in answering questions. To a lot of them, the really more private questions, they weren't interested in answering because they didn't know why they would be sharing that information. So I think that there's a lot more work to be done in the district, and then that information, if you're right, will be extremely helpful.
They might have been more forthcoming if it was actually being there rather than us that the members have seen it.
Or if they had an advance notice as to what's going on, a little bit more upfront information, maybe they would be more willing to talk. So, good, Lori.
Did you develop the survey instrument that you used, or was that something given to you by the client?
Survey?
It wasn't a formal survey.
No.
It wasn't a formal survey. When the students went to the businesses, it was to populate the spreadsheet that was the business inventory, but it wasn't a formal survey instrument. It was just to collect information for the spreadsheet.
So is that something that you recommended or developed? Because the replication of it is definitely where it adds value beyond what you did here. And it's a wonderful tool with a spreadsheet, but I wonder if, given what you're saying about the difficulty of people answering and knowing what your key questions are and how to use time efficiently, and what you had on that last slide, you know, about the size of the business, number of employees, whatever the key things would be, did you develop an instrument that you recommended to them? No, you didn't.
Just the spreadsheet.
No.
We just
But
enhanced the
It was
spreadsheet.
You did find the methodology from University of Wisconsin?
Sort of. It was like they collaborated on that, but there wasn't a survey in there about how to conduct the survey. Like the questions that you would ask the business owners while you're conducting the inventory. Yes, it would have been good, but we didn't focus on that. It's something.
It wasn't in your.
Yeah, it wasn't in our spectrum of work.
It wasn't what they had wanted.
Yeah, they weren't really interested in it. So, but yeah, to have a standardization on how to fill out and conduct an interview would probably be very helpful.
I guess my last question would be, what skill sets, in retrospect, did you wish that you had going into this project? I mean, given you have a diverse array of people in the group, fine, you know, but was there any skill set or knowledge area that you found yourself going, gee, I wish we had somebody who knew something in this area?
Well, initially, early on, we decided to use Excel as a software program because that's what the client wanted. But early on, we had talked about maybe doing something a little bit more comprehensive with the database. And we looked around as a group and we said collectively that we would prefer someone to have some sort of expertise like that. But it worked out in the long run that Excel was what they wanted, so that's what we went with.
I mean, obviously, doing an Access database would have been nice in one dimension. On the other hand, the maintenance and upkeep of that after you're gone is always an issue for these kind of projects. I mean, what is the robustness and sustainability of wherever we become? So, any other questions? All right, good. Nice job. Oh, good. Oh, so Dan, sorry.
I'm Dan Spees, I'm a colleague of
Yes.
everyone in the Dukakis Center. Who did the 2006 survey?
That was provided
They did.
by Main Streets and the city of Boston.
So Main Street had done a survey of
No, you're using the word survey. All I can tell you is they provided us a table full of data.
of data about West Roxbury.
Mhm.
Okay, about West Roxbury businesses.
So the West Roxbury Business District had undergone a couple of executive directors. There had been a few replacements in a short period of time, and so I think a lot of their institutional memory left, and also there was no formal documentation. So we couldn't replicate, and the current director couldn't provide to us the methodology that was used in 2006 to classify the different businesses.
Okay.
So we did the comparison, but with these caveats. And so the inventory that the team completed this year, we made comparisons, but there's a lot of caveats.
So my question was, are you comparing apples to apples from 2006 and 2011, given that the categories may not be the same? Especially since you brought up repeatedly that you were all quite interested in the fact that real estate, legal, and finance category went down. But I also noticed that the healthcare went down, I think, by a bigger percentage, which also kind of stuck out in my head as well. It'd be interesting to see why that went down as well.
The types of what they meant by healthcare also.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's
Yeah,
methodology.
could have been some doctor's offices, who the heck knows?
Exactly, and you may not know that, given the fact that previous directors may have just taken information with them. So you're given what you're given.
Right.
And I think that's interesting. I think with more, you said that initially there was an interest in knowing the business mix, and was there an interest in knowing whether if this was the right mix? Or did this fall out of the scope of the project?
It was an interest in knowing if it was the right mix, but because we didn't really have time or anything to compare it to, or really suggestions about how to do that, we gave them the analysis, and then we gave them sort of something to look at next.
Right.
So yeah, I think that they had these ideas of what the right mix should be, and our kind of gentle showing them was that maybe they're wrong.
Right. I mean, I'm sure you guys there's so much to work with here. I'm sure you've got like a million ideas. And just to kind of end, I think that data collection always seems kind of tedious and mundane, but it's essential, and it takes a lot of time. But it's also the basis of all your policy analysis and your recommendations and ultimately legislation. So I mean, it's critical. So well done.
Sorry about that.
Just to follow up, I think that's what's going to be critical about having the NAICS codes moving forward. So it will be standardized. We did not have that up until us doing it. So.
Yeah, thanks, great.